and I'm going to be presenting today a story. And this is something that, as a science educator, especially in biology, I think stories are both an important way to think about biology, but also a very useful mechanism in terms of educating others about the interesting topics and concepts in science. Now, the underlying and main theme of my talk today is how we got to what we are, the growth of human being biological thought. And so this really represents a historical to modern times way of thinking about how we view ourselves, about how we view our bodies. And this is not so much a talk about anatomy and physiology, the math of cardiac output, but a little bit more about the conceptual way in which we thought both about our bodies and to some degree our place within the biosphere of the Earth, including all the other creatures that live on it. By way of introduction, I'm Stephen Gazier. I have a PhD in molecular genetics and cell biology, and I've been teaching biology for the past 8 years at First University New Orleans and now Ball State University in Indiana, although in Second Life, you can just call me Stephen Xootfly. Now, the structure of this talk is not just a matter of, like I was saying, stories are important. And so the talk itself is structured in a way that I'll be telling you the story of a class that I taught, that I developed myself and taught both last summer and last fall, called Development of Biological Theorems. And in fact, if you keep an eye on my slides, make sure you read the titles of the slides because those are chapter headings like in the form of a book. And so the thought I'm going to convey about being what it means to be a human being biologically is actually going to be conveyed in kind of a historical story of how this class was taught. So, but as a prelude to that story, I would like to talk a little bit about how I got particularly interested in thinking about the history of biology, the philosophy of thinking about how things change. And what I have up here is a screen capture of the Earl K. Long Library at University of New Orleans, where one day as I was searching for, I think, an old biology textbook, I happened across this book by Dr. Charles Joseph Singer called A History of Biology to about the year 1900. And it was this small, nondescript book, but I thought, wow, that's an interesting title. And so I opened it, flipped it open, and I just started reading it. And so I think one thing to point out for this story is it really starts with a matter of serendipity. And this really, more than anything else, is what got me thinking about the history of biology and how ideas change. And as a commentary, my career as a biologist, while as an undergraduate biochemistry major, and then a graduate student, and even as a postdoc, while we frequently try to understand the specific history and publications in our select fields, that very rarely includes a more encompassing view of the history of biology. Now, while I was teaching my biology class in Second Life, among others, I had a book publisher come by and say, hey, we have a bunch of textbooks. Would you be interested? I'm like, no, I'm not interested in any textbooks. However, as I was flipping through the catalog, I noticed a bunch of just regular books. I'm like, oh, I didn't even know, I think it was Freeman even sells regular books. And among them was this book called Of Moths and Men by Judith Hooper. And this was a story about the scientists involved in the famous peppered moth experiments in the mid-1900s, which was the basically nicely demonstrated proof of evolution in action. And so I don't want to go too much into that particular story. I actually gave a talk for the Science Circle called Moths, Black and White Proof of Evolution. And you can find that on the Science Circle webpage and review that one. But again, it was reminding me that the stories of the men and the scientists who conduct the science and the context can actually be a really powerful way of conveying important scientific thoughts. Now, one of my more favorite books that came out of that group was Remarkable Creatures by Sean B. Carroll, who is a evolutionary biologist at University of Wisconsin-Madison, has published a great number of books, has a great number of Howard Hughes Medical Institute seminars, as well as he's been a guest speaker for What Darwin Never Knew, which is a great Nova PBS show, talking about evolution in a modern context. And so, but his book, again, his take on this, among other books he's published, like Making of the Fittest, is a bunch of stories and vignettes about the scientists while they were conducting their important science. So this would include people like Wallace, Darwin, Dubois, a variety of others. That, again, I recommend reading the book if you'd like to hear a great set of stories and some interesting biology and science along the way. Now, one of the giants in terms of science communication and communicating important ideas in biology is Stephen Jay Gould, who was an American paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of scientists. He wrote a bunch of essays, I think for the New York Times, which have been compiled into a variety of books. And so, again, very interesting person. But again, another book where, again, telling stories from not just a historical perspective, but trying to connect historically important science to a modern context and how that can individually change our thoughts and views about science, the world, and what we are in there. Someone that you may not know as well is Stephen Johnson, a current writer, an American popular science writer. And he wrote a book called The Ghost Map. And The Ghost Map is a very nice layman's narrative for understanding how the work done by one man in order to understand how disease transmission worked. And this is John Snow in London in 1854, along with actually a wide body of work that this particular book somewhat just mentions. Ilsa says The Ghost Map is brilliant, and I just have to agree that in terms of understanding the history of science, important scientists and contributions, and how to do science, it's an amazing body of work. So what we understand now about how disease, again, these are all books I'll be mentioning later, so I just want to mention the bibliography that we had for the class. But these are all books that over time I have, again, accumulated and read in order to help teach this class. And what I want to also introduce is, in terms of my reading, one of the important concepts and frameworks in which a lot of science works these days is from a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And this was, I think, published in the 1960s and introduced the term paradigm shift. And so if you haven't heard that term before, you probably have, because it's become a very popular way of describing almost any time someone thinks they have a brilliant idea for how they think things are different than before. So it's a somewhat overused word. But in terms of a scientific framework, I think it's very important, both as a scientist and in many ways thinking about culture and politics and technology, that we explore a little bit about what a paradigm shift is. And in his structure, Kuhn describes how before there's a lot of common understanding of how scientific phenomena work. For example, chemistry in the 1600s was more this body of alchemy, would be a good example. That people didn't have a framework, an agreement, and really weren't per se pursuing new knowledge via a scientifically rigorous manner. Yeah, so null subset mentions falsibility. Again, the Sir Francis Bacon methodology of trying to understand new ideas. And so this is something that, again, all ways in which we think about science, or many ways culture or psychology, they go through this phase. And then as people start to develop norms, start to develop communications, start to develop a more structured way of looking at some phenomenon, we call that a paradigm. And what happens once a paradigm has been articulated, that people conduct normal science. And this is science that tries to extend the knowledge, try and create more precise measurements of the phenomena, basically try to in many ways support the main idea of the paradigm. And that's because, again, when one thinks about hypothesis testing, one starts with a framework that you have in your mind that makes the most sense. And so in many cases, it's hard to imagine in conducting normal science the ability to say, oh, I'm going to expect something completely unexpected. But this next term that you see under there, the term anomaly, this is something Kuhn described as an experiment that produces something that does not make any sense given the current paradigm. And so that has to be explored. Now again, sometimes, so this largely marks the next phase, that of crisis, where when anomaly means the paradigm might be wrong, then the community has to try and understand that. And so the example, he gives several examples of this. Again, there are times where the paradigm itself could just be inarticulated. It could be that the particular experiment that's supposed to be anomalous result, in fact, is not well done. There are a variety of explanations that can all make sense in terms of what that anomaly could have been. But basically, when that anomaly comes up and is published and communicated, then the community has to decide on a way in which to decide whether it's real, not real, and needs to be addressed. Again, in many cases, an anomaly will lead to a resolution of this is a different way of thinking about it. The anomaly is true, so the paradigm must be wrong, and then one must develop a new paradigm. Now, for a new paradigm to be useful, Kuhn describes it as being something that must have objectivity, be accurate, be consistent, have a broad scope, and actually be fruitful. Again, this is one thing that's important, is that paradigm shifts need to start producing new results from normal science that help make everything make sense. And so normal science then extends that new paradigm. But typically what happens in almost all scientific fields is that as new rounds of normal science are conducted, new anomalies come up, then new crises, and in fact, what one does in this situation is one repeats as necessary until the experiments actually, until a new paradigm and shift occurs. So one of the most prominent examples of this is, and he uses this in the book, is talking about why things burn. And so in the original paradigm, people had this, and this is again England in the 1700s, that things burn by putting off phlogiston, and that this is a combustible element that is there, and that air itself doesn't have any value or meaning or composition. It's just something that is there. And so again, so the anomaly that happened though is that, and if you look down below the screen, you'll see two boxes, one with a mouse and a candle that's burning down, and another one with a sprig of mint that's burning down. And this was an experiment that was conducted by Joseph Priestley, and this is something that is conveyed in another really nice Stephen Johnson book called The Invention of Oxygen, or The Invention of Air, sorry. And you'll notice that on the left, the box with the mouse, the candle has burnt out, and then what happens is the mouse basically dies. And this is a phenomenon that had been noticed for a long time. You put living animals in a box and with a burning candle, and they die. And so the anomaly in this case, though, was that when Joseph Priestley put a plant, which at the time was just considered organic material, a living organism, the expectation would be that that candle would also burn out and then the plant would die. But as you notice on the right, you'll notice that the candle is still burning. The sprig of mint does not die. And so this meant the paradigm of phlogiston did not make sense anymore. Now, I won't go through all of the experimental follow-up and analysis with this, but it really meant, and this is, I think, as Stephen Johnson eloquently puts it in The Invention of Air, that this was the beginning of an understanding that different organic life forms are different, so plants are very different than humans, and that we have a cycle in which they produce, and this is something everyone knows now, they produce oxygen that we use to make carbon dioxide, and they can take carbon dioxide along with water and energy from the sun to make more oxygen, as well as make their organic structures and make sugar. And so this anomaly then allowed for people to develop new experiments and to both confirm and extend the idea. And so again, this is during the crisis phase. Other people, Antoine Laurent Lavoisier and Carl Scheele, both demonstrated that oxygen was a gas. And now we have this modern idea that air is a combination of gases, and that oxidation, again, the chemical breakdown of molecules with energy along with combustion, leads to these phenomena, and that we need to do that ourselves to fuel ourselves, and that plants do as well, but plants also can take energy from the environment. Okay, so the other idea I want to introduce, and this is one that's very popular in science, is that we stand on the shoulders of giants. And this is an old Latin phrase, and I will not butcher the Latin pronunciation of it. But one of the famous quotes from, again, Isaac Newton was, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And again, with this idea, and what he's trying to credit is the idea, of course, that for paradigms, for us to do work and have a working paradigm, and those paradigms were built up by giants. But I do want to make one quick point. So I'm going to res out a media screen here, and this should automatically play for you, although I was having some issues with it a little bit earlier. I will also throw the link into local chat if you want to watch it in QuickTime. Is that loading for people? Maybe most importantly, if anybody's filming this, is this actually playing? No? Very weird. It's weird because when I'm in the edit phase, I can see the video and I can load it up here. Let me try one thing really quick. Yeah, so if you can, just watch the link. That should open up in any web browser, and I'll just take this out. I don't know. Yeah, so watch the link. Okay, so probably everyone's seen that by now. And yeah, I'll give a quick description. That's just a short edited version of the Orson Welles movie David and Goliath, in which David slays the giant. And so that's kind of a quick media way I wanted to convey the idea that while I think it's very important to recognize and acknowledge that there are giants in science who've helped us develop paradigms, that every giant idea ultimately is going to meet its David that slays it. And I'll leave that at that. Again, I put the credits for the movie at the end to make sure you knew where it was coming from. All right, so one of the other important books, though, that I think is an important reference for both my class and this talk is that when Thomas Kuhn gave his description of various paradigm shifts, he largely described ones in chemistry and physics. And that in terms of a modern understanding of biology, there's been another historian, philosopher of science, Ernst Mayr, who himself was an evolutionary biologist and well-published and well-regarded before he went to publishing, but that this book, The Growth of Biological Thought, is an important reference point that describes why biology, in terms of paradigms and in terms of the profession and the field, is quite different than what you have in physics and chemistry in certain ways. And some of those aspects include, and this is again just a listing taken from the book, is that biology exhibits a certain complexity and organization that you do not see either in geology or chemistry or physics. There's a certain chemical uniqueness. Again, we aren't just any sort of chemistry. We are a specific set of chemistry designed for metabolism, designed for making our very biological-like structures. That quality is an element, not quantity. So again, instead of it being like a bunch of chemistry molecules, a solution, say, of hydrochloric acid, all the hydrochloric acid is the same, and it's just a matter of how much of it you have. Whereas in biology, you have these units of complex of organisms. Uniqueness and variability. And again, this variability is one of the key concepts, is that while chemistry and physics can describe a whole bunch of different elements, the unit structure, the unit, say, of a molecule, or the unit of an atom, or the unit of force, those are all the same thing, and they are described very specifically. But in biology, the unit organism tends to be individuals and animals or bacteria. And that even though we talk about a species, they actually are quite variable. Again, tagline mentions, I've never felt sorry for Goliath before. I recommend you watch this one. If you do a TED Talk search for slaying Goliath, you'll feel even more sorry for Goliath after you watch that one. Again, that's I'm blanking on the presenter's name, but he's a writer for the New Yorker. And then again, biology all consists of having genetic programs, these ideas that we have blueprints in typically DNA that describes and organizes how the individual units, the organisms are. But what everything is right now depends upon what came before it, that this genetic program is passed along generations, and then it changes, it becomes variable. But what you ultimately have in the end is something that's been influenced by the environment and the selective pressures that have led to that current organism. And again, that's one thing that in the end with biology is very unpredictable, is that it's hard to determine what sort of influences the environment will have, how other species will act upon other species in terms of predator-prey or competition for mates. And so biology becomes this very unique field of study in this way that's quite different than, say, physics or chemistry. All right, so that was the prologue, setting up the idea of how the class ultimately dealt with and was structured in order to look at some very important concepts and paradigm shifts within the class. What I have listed up here is just a few pictures from that class. Again, you see in the top right-hand side, there's Flora, who's my TA avatar, which I got from an old biology secretary. And she's standing there with a kitten, one of my cats. Yeah, Flora's fun. Again, I can't take credit for having dressed her. I had a friend put her together to look nice. Again, you see the students did use both a mixture of the classroom as well as Second Life. We had some nice talks in Second Life, and very thankful to the Science Circle for helping to be a playground and classroom for those students. All right. And I think that this is something, when I introduced the particular paradigm shifts that we talked about in the class, I really wanted to focus on ones in which the crisis phase was particularly agonizing or long. And so we'll talk about this more later, but the idea that the questioning, confirming, and resolution was something that was not simple. So while one of the most amazing revolutions in science has been the structure of DNA, as published by Watson and Crick, and elucidated by Rosalind Franklin with X-ray crystallography, that doesn't fit what I wanted to do with the class, because once that was done, everyone's like, oh yeah, that's of course. And then there was no real debate about the structure of DNA. And so that one, well, as an example, something really important, but not necessarily fitting this crisis heavy type of paradigm shift. All right, so chapter 1, let's talk about some early concepts of man. And this is a diagram coming from the Charles Singer book, Hippocrates, the Four Humors, that the composition of the body was thought to be this mixture of the elements. So fire and earth and water and air. Again, this is a nice, lovely conceptual framework. And of course, the way this worked is that when you have combinations of the elements, so a combination of air and fire led to the attribute of hot. And the combination, say, of water and earth led to the attribute of cold. Now, when one applies this to the body, when one applies this, then you can also, you might have heard of the four humors. And so the idea is that our body is comprised of four liquid elements that really represents one of the four different elements in all of nature. And then in addition to thinking about the body being comprised of these four elements, when you think about the attributes, when you combine the elements together, is that these represent different types of, say, disease or behavioral states of a person. And so if you've ever heard the term sanguine, that, again, that's the Greek word for blood, sanguinity. That's very fiery and hot, very passionate. And that meant that the amount of blood in your body was higher than other parts of your body. And then same thing, if you're earth element, that led to melancholia, that tended to mean you were more melancholic. So this idea was a combination that our health and our behavior was related to the balance of the four humors in the body. In addition, when we think about what is the animating life force? So those are just liquids, but how do we move? How do we think? Kosaki asked, what does humor here mean? It actually means liquid. It's just another term for liquid. Again, if you think of blood, phlegm, bile, those are, again, compositions of liquid in your body. But again, Aristotle also wanted to talk about psyche, and actually psyche meant breath. And the reason psyche, and which is also the root word for psychology, was used because when people were alive, their chest would move up and down. And so that's why you could relate breathing to being an animated force, and that's where the word comes from. And that early concepts of taking man is that the amount of animating force you had, whether it was a rational animating force or it was things that related to animals which were separate than man. Again, man was not considered an animal. Animals were separate. Or vegetables. And again, you'll notice that one of the namesakes of my TA there in the back, that's related to vegetables. And that, again, that was early Greek thoughts. And of course, man had life breathed into him by the gods. But between Greek mythology and modern times in Western Europe, man was considered to be a divine creation. And again, this is Michelangelo's work with Adam and God, and saying this is how the body of man came about, and that it has a very important divine place in the universe, having been divinely created. Now, when it came time to the idea of naturalists thinking about the place of man on the earth and in the universe, there's this concept where not so much the same as the psyche or the animating force from Aristotle, but that every species on the planet had a certain character, and this would be something defined by its ethos, and that and that basically every individual within a species was based off this template of what they were supposed to be. And again, this is still very much a supernatural type of thought and explanation. But that within the scala natura, the scale of nature, that this was a ladder in which there were very undivine organisms at the very bottom, microorganisms, then getting up to, say, salamanders and amphibians, and then to lizards, and then to more mammals, that man was the pinnacle of nature's creatures. He was the most divine, and his ethos was the most important. Now, so these are early concepts of man, and these men, of being a man, and what your body was composed of. And this is also true for the medical journals. And now, in chapter 2, we're going to talk a little bit about evolution. And this really, I think it's very important to talk about the contributions, most specifically, of Charles Darwin, which is a name that most everybody here is familiar with. And he published in 1859 on the origin of species. And again, the struggle for life. So there's a much longer term than origin of species, but I'll just refer to it that way. Yeah, and so at the time, and Darwin delayed publication of his work because he was very much afraid of what the religious authorities and politics would have in terms of whether it would or would not adopt this idea. But he ultimately did publish, and he had a lot of backing from a lot of naturalists. And I think one thing that I've discovered over time in my reading, that Darwin put a really good picture together, but we should not dismiss the idea that he was the first one thinking about natural causes to how species come about on the planet. He's not the only one who was proposing an atheistic view of how science and biology worked. But he was the first one to put together a well-argued, with lots of examples, argument to say how this came about. And in fact, he actually had two separate arguments. He both had a combination of descent with modification. So this idea, again, that we inherit molecules and our characteristics from our progenitors, our parents, or from, splitting off in terms of fission-based organisms. And then those that have the best chance of survival end up being the ones that allow survival. And that if there are traits that let some survive versus not others, then that is essentially what works. And so I have a little quick demonstration here that, again, if we take a look at this ramp, we have a certain set of balls that are variable. These are balls that are variable in size. And what I'm going to do is let these run down. Woo! So you'll notice that in terms of the filters that existed going down the ramp, only a subset of related creatures survived. Those that were a little bit smaller, and the ones that were too big to get through the filter, in fact, did not survive. So you can imagine that the small ones that were able to survive, they'll make more progeny, and that the starting population or the next generation of those balls will in fact be the new population. And again, Darwin argued that if you give this enough time, that you start to branch off the creatures, that they become distinct creatures in their own right, and so they develop their own niches, their own character, and they get very well refined. That again, if you are a creature trying to get to a particular adaptation, that one reason why creatures look perfectly adapted to their environment, which was an argument for design and an argument for creators, that this is a very natural process. And Kosacki, I will get to that point in a little bit, and I like that one. And so again, in terms of thinking about Homo sapiens and who we really are the result of the genetics of our ancestors, and in terms of the place and time, the selective pressures we had, those filters that we had to get through, that they ultimately have led to what we are today. And again, in terms of upright posture, getting rid of hair, enlarged brain. And again, I'm not going to go through all the specifics of this, but just to represent the idea that where we came from is partly a matter of the pressures we had to deal with and had to survive. Again, one idea that's important to mention in terms of selective pressure and evolution is that we did have cohabitating Homo sapiens on the planet. And early on, people thought Neanderthals were a progenitor to Homo sapiens, because that's what, they look similar, they look more primitive, and thus we are a more highly evolved form of that. But one of the recent things that's come out from the scientific literature and investigations is that, no, we're not the same species. We did not evolve from them, but we did have a common ancestor a long time ago. And then in addition to that, even more modern ways of thinking is that we actually did co-survive with them at the same time in Europe. And that in all actuality, looking at DNA sequences, looking at and analyzing DNA, that it wasn't a matter of our coming into Europe and now competing a slow, dim-witted cousin, but in fact, we co-bred with them and intermingled our DNA. And so that right now, almost all humans on the planet have between 1.5 to about 4.5% of their DNA that we can recognize as being descended from Neanderthal DNA. And again, how is this useful? The argument is that in all likelihood, there's a recent study that perhaps some of that Neanderthal DNA helped us fight off certain viral infections. And I'll leave it at that. But again, this is an example, though, where you can sometimes have a little bit of mixing inside the tree, and that we're not just, per se, one branch of it. So, tagline, hybrid vigor is something that's very well demonstrated in plants. It's not necessarily a concept that's always applied to mammalian admixture, but the idea that we are more vigorous in terms of being able to survive certain diseases, I think that's a fair way of putting it. But it's more complicated than that quick way of describing it. Okay, so another paradigm that we described in the class was talking about what happened to the dinosaurs. So again, the old way of thinking about dinosaurs, again, when I was growing up, was the idea that they were cold-blooded and lumbering and slow creatures that came about. And in fact, what I have here is another movie clip. This one I know was working for me earlier in World, so I'll throw this out here. And that should autoplay for you, although you might need to click it. Okay, so that's from the classic silent movie from, I think, 1921, The Lost World. And again, if anybody had trouble viewing that, let me just grab the URL. Yeah, if you're on a Mac, Macs and the QuickTime plugin have issues sometimes with Second Life, and that's something that Linden Labs needs to eventually fix. Okay. So again, it's just a short clip showing an example. Again, even though the technology for movie making at the time was not quite the same as what we have now, the idea that creatures like dinosaurs, while they ruled the world for quite some time, were slow and lumbering and stupid. And here's an example of our modern view of the same animal, T-Rex. Again, a much more sleek, fast, smart predator. And that not only are they no longer considered cold-blooded lizards, we actually think of them as potentially mesothermic as well as fast. And again, a part of this comes about from, again, two stories that I had in the class, Dinosaurs of a Feather and The Telltale Wishbone, as well as a little bit of discussion from Dinomania from Stephen Jay Gould, that a paleontologist, John Ostrom, discovered the Deinonychus claw, and that the features of this claw and the hunting habits of dinosaurs was very different than this idea of being slow lumbering lizards. And this comes from understanding the bone structure. Although interestingly, people had suspected from Darwin's day, Darwin was familiar with Archaeopteryx, which is a mixture, it's considered a transitional species between dinosaurs and the modern bird. And so, again, if you're old enough, you might have heard that dinosaurs don't exist anymore, they all went extinct. Well, one branch of them that, again, became birds before they all went extinct is, in fact, the warm-blooded, egg-laying set of creatures we know as birds. Now, in terms of that extinction, and this is something that's worth mentioning, is that people do not have a clear understanding of why the dinosaurs died. They thought they were just slow and stupid, so the mammals must have outcompeted them. And again, if you look at this picture on the bottom right, the wider the yellow, the light yellow bubbles, the more prevalence and number of species you have. And so the original understanding was, oh, mammals came along, they were smart, they were fast, they were warm-blooded, so they made all the dinosaurs go extinct. And that makes sense when you think about dinosaurs being cold-blooded and slow. But our modern understanding of this comes from the idea that the Alvarez, Lewis, and Walter, they discovered an iridium layer in the geological history, which again suggested that a gigantic meteor hit the planet and caused that extinction. So Beth asks, what is the definition of mesothermic? Again, warm-blooded, where your heat comes from the inside of your body, is called endothermic. And if you're cold-blooded, you're known as exothermic because your warmth is coming from outside your body. And so meso is a term meaning in between those two. Meso meaning that you have features of being warm-blooded, but also features of being cold-blooded. Does that make sense, Beth? And again, the idea of feathers coming about for birds, people thought the current model is that dinosaurs also had feathers, that many of them had feathers, and that may have been involved in both mating displays as well as thermal regulation. And that's where they came from before they were in fact wings and used for flight. Yeah, sharks, I know there's some species of sharks that are considered mesothermic as well. Well, so I can't get into the bigger issues of why some species existed after the meteor impact versus others, because it's really not known in the scientific community exactly why dinosaurs were so sensitive. But people largely believe the current paradigm is that because dinosaurs were typically very large, they had very high eating requirements, and that during a period of time, where there wasn't enough photosynthesis, there just wasn't enough plant life to help support their very large sizes. Yeah, so I don't want to get much into that. But that's what's great about this, what's great about science is that these are things where we have evidence, we come up with theories, we try and confirm or falsify them. And so it's always something new to learn. Okay, so one paradigm, sorry, I should go back. Sorry, the questions distract me from one of the main points is that for mammals and for humans like ourselves to exist on the planet, the dinosaurs probably had to die because they were such better, efficient predators that it'd be hard for any mammals to become the dominant top predatory species or to become prevalent as larger-bodied primates. Okay, so one of the paradigms that came out of Darwinian evolution is the idea that all evolution is descent with modification, that every single instance of a new species came from directly their progenitors. And so this idea was overturned by Lynn Margulis, who you also might know as Mrs. Carl Sagan. And this is the readings that we had from the class. The idea here is that eukaryotic cells, as they pretty much all exist on the planet today, have these little power packs inside called mitochondria. And those mitochondria aren't something that developed within eukaryotic cells, but in fact are something that came from a bacterium that invaded a eukaryotic progenitor cell and then took up residence, and then the two formed a very close, tight-knit symbiotic relationship that allowed us to become more prevalent. And so what I have here is an example here. Here's an example of a cell, which we'll res. And again, what we have on top there is one glucose molecule. Glucose, you're familiar with that as sugar. Now, what sort of energy can come out of that? And in terms of taking out glucose, basically you can have some other molecules. Look inside the cell, you'll see two ATP molecules. So those are the ones with little orange balls on them. And that's how much energy we could get without mitochondria. On the other hand, if you have a cell, and the one I'm res out here on the right, this is a cell that does have mitochondria. And the amount of energy that, again, as long as you have lots of oxygen, I think I res the wrong one. Oh, I must have not grabbed the right one. But again, if you have a cell that does have mitochondria, then the amount of ATP you can get out of it is what you see represented here on the screen. So we go from a matter of 2 ATP molecules to approximately 32 to 34. And so that difference in energy, as contributed by having lots and lots more mitochondria and a partner for making energy, means that eukaryotes are able to utilize more energy, but they also need oxygen. So again, this comes back to the story with the mice and the plants, that you have to have oxygen to survive and make enough energy. And again, the idea that plants are things that can harvest energy from the environment, that actually comes from a secondary endosymbiosis invasion of the chloroplasts. And so again, that's how we have plants. That's how we have, if you basically look at the entirety of the nature you can visually see around us, those all depend upon, in terms of being large-scale organisms, having bacterial partners that now reside in our cells. So not all evolution is a matter of branching. Again, there's another paradigm that's important to recognize in terms of Darwinian evolution, and this primarily comes from the neo-Darwinists and Mendelian genetics. Again, this might be a flashback for you that in Mendelian genetics, what you have are different alleles. We eukaryotes have 2 copies of each one, and as we have progeny, they get half of our genome, and then these become different ways that we shuffle around genes inside. But that this really argues that all genes have a very stable structure, that our chromosomes, the organization of the genes, are pretty much always the same. Now, this paradigm was overturned by Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1983 for the observation of what people call typically jumping genes. And these are called transposons. They're able to move, again, trans being a root word for like transportation, transcontinental. And again, what the main contrast compared to the previous picture is that those corn kernels on the far right are speckled, whereas in Mendelian genetics, the solid brown or the solid orange are what you would only expect from Mendelian genetics and from Darwinian ways of thinking about chromosome structure. Again, this is a quick diagram showing that, again, what happens with DNA is that things can move around. DNA moves around, is capable of getting into a new place. So each one of these really represents their own type of organism, that their environment is in fact genomes and chromosomes of other organisms. And so in some ways, I think it's very reasonable to think of them as parasites, genomic parasites. On the other hand, when you look at the entirety of a chromosome, and this is the human genome showing the composition of all the different elements inside the human genome, that very little of it is actually human proteins and genes, and that we found that many examples of novel genetic variation comes from the movement or the presence of these elements inside our genome. So even though we think of them as parasites, they also end up having useful traits, useful contributions sometimes too. One of the last paradigms we explored in the class was thinking about bacteria only as pathogens. So again, this is an example of the Great Plague, the Black Death, basically Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague. And this idea that diseases were transmitted by bacteria and causes human affliction, this is something that John Snow was investigating in terms of cholera. And this ultimately led to the germ theory of disease. Again, there's Louis Pasteur, who is generally credited as being one of the main people involved and organized in the scientific community that really codified this idea of germs causing diseases, and that the presence of a germ leads to the presence of the disease. One of the other pioneers at the time that you may or may not have heard about is Robert Koch, who was someone who codified this into Koch's postulates, where the presence of a disease meant you get sick, and that you can basically reproduce that by taking the disease agent, putting it into a new person, that person gets sick, that tells you that that's the disease causing organism. So again, I think this is something that's familiar with many people, the idea that germs cause disease. And we developed, from a technology point of view, a weapon against these diseases. This is showing Sir Alexander Fleming, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for helping to discover and then ultimately produce antibiotics. And again, the idea that penicillin was used, it actually saved multitudes of lives, saved lots and lots of lives. So in no way should we say that antibiotics are a bad idea if used judiciously. Now again, a bit of a parallel storyline. If anybody here has ever had or known someone who had an ulcer, in the old days, people thought that ulcers were due to stress. And so you would get these little holes in your lining, in your stomach lining, because you were just having a hard time, and that was causing acid to be released in your stomach and making holes. And so the paradigm shift here in that particular field was the idea that ulcers are actually due to bacteria. And so again, this is the Nobel Prize, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, two Australian researchers who show that these specific bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, are in fact the causative agent, and you can cure ulcers by giving people antibiotics, to giving them antibiotics because it's caused by a bacterium. Now, this idea of treating germs with bacteria for ulcers or infections or whatever, there is potentially a problem with this, because I think for a lot of you who are familiar with vitamins in our diets, there's a great vitamin called vitamin K, and vitamin K is something that helps us clot our blood. And again, I'm going to pop out a quick version of that molecule here in front of the screen. But that vitamin K is important for us to coagulate and put blood together. But where does our vitamin K mostly come from? It actually comes from bacteria. The majority of it comes from bacteria that live in our guts. And so we aren't producers of our own chemistry. We actually share those responsibilities by providing safe harbor for bacteria in order to do that. So if any of you out there have ever taken a broad spectrum antibiotic, what does the doctor typically recommend that you do? Yeah, eat yogurt. Eat yogurt because it has lactobacillus in it, which can help potentially repopulate the bacteria that died in your stomach. Now, the work that's come out of some work, and this is nicely characterized in a book by Dr. Martin Blazer, called Missing Microbes, that when we start using lots of antibiotics, we actually might be harming our overall health. Okay, and so I can't go through the entirety of the slide, but even though we've reduced the amount of gastric cancer by treating ulcers and treating Helicobacter pylori, at the same time, we're seeing an increase in the amount of asthma. We're seeing an increase in esophageal cancer. We're seeing a concomitant rise in other problems, including obesity, because one thing that these bacteria do is influence our energy utilization and our energy balance. And in fact, here's a nice slide coming from the New York Academy of Sciences report that on the left are the obesity trends in the United States. The darker red, the more percentage of people are obese. On the right, the darker blue you have, the more antibiotics are being prescribed per capita. And so you see a pretty good correlation, which again is backed up by individual experiments in labs with mice and a variety of other areas. So again, it's not just this one chart, but the idea that we're increasing obesity by killing off our bacteria is a very prominent one. So the last paradigm shift that I talked about in the class is the idea that aging is just a matter of wearing out. Now again, as we get older, we of course feel more worn out. We feel more stress. And of course, if we have mechanical devices, the more we use them, then it's very obvious that they tend to start breaking down because we're using them more. Now, from a cellular point of view, there's this idea of the Hayflick limit. And that what you have in this graph on the x-axis is how long you have culture, a bunch of mammalian cells in a culture dish. And on the y-axis, going up, is essentially how many population doublings you're getting. And you'll notice that it flattens out. So this means that after a certain amount of time, growth flattens out. And our understanding of this is now the idea that there are these things called telomeres, which are caps at the end of chromosomes that are very important for keeping our linear chromosomes intact. And that, in fact, if we do not keep this enzymatic activity in these caps active, then in fact, ultimately cells burn out. And what I have here, just as a quick example, is that what we really all have in terms of our chromosomes is a candle that's burning down. And that as we grow older, it's not a matter of wearing out. It's a matter of losing the capacity for our cells to keep making more cells. And so this candle and these telomeres really represent a limit on human lifespan over time. And that this is a part of the design of our chromosomes. Now, of course, people would like to overcome this. People think about this all the time. And how is this related to human health? And so the idea, though, that we all necessarily have this limited lifespan is overturned by the observation that some cells can be immortal. And so HeLa cells, which are derived from a woman named Henrietta Lacks, who had cervical cancer, and that's what she died from. When they took those cells out of her body, they in fact are immortal. And these were used and have been used in science and cell biology as a way for people to conduct experiments on common cells, and we don't lose them over time. But basically, Henrietta Lacks is someone who, at least some of her cells, maintain this immortality. And so the question will be, and you've seen this sometimes in science fiction movies, is that telomere maintenance or telomere reconstruction is a way to achieve immortality. Although it's not quite as simple as that. So in summary, what are we? And again, this is from Da Vinci. Think about what is man? What is mankind? And what I want to say first of all is that in terms of thinking about what we are a blueprint for this bodily design. And this bodily design comes from the coding the genetic information in our DNA. But in fact, the vast majority of our DNA is not even us. We have these genomic passengers, these transposons and repetitive elements that actually reside, and we are carriers for their genetic information that sometimes contributes to novel uses in our genome. In addition to that, all of our cells have these mitochondria inside them that, again, for us to be able to maintain our large body size, for our ability to metabolize and utilize oxygen, that we are co-evolving, or we have now in a symbiogenic relationship with these intracellular bacteria that help us keep moving. So, and they have their own DNA, they have their own genetics. So in fact, they are kind of their own semi-independent organism. In addition to that, we have lots of bacteria that live outside of our cells, And so, in fact, it's not just a matter of having bacteria that live inside our cells. We are this co-evolving form of organism that some of these bacteria are very important for, say, producing vitamin K, or helping us with our energy metabolism, or helping ward off esophageal cancer. And we've co-evolved with them in a way that our immune system is more healthy when we live with these within this ecosystem of being the human body with bacteria. And again, if you look carefully at this next one, at the image's left foot, then in fact, we aren't just humans. We carry the legacy of one of our distinct species cousins, the Neanderthals. And so in many ways, we are a hybrid of both Homo sapiens as well as Homo neanderthalis in terms of what we really represent in our genomes. Although it's really a small contribution, so it's just the left foot. And then, so finally, again, just representing that here we are on this branch, and that within the planet, this branch has evolved in a way that the only way for us to be here is we also had to exist and all of our ancestors had to survive the travails that they had. And of course, one thing that was very helpful was for the dinosaurs to go away. So we are also the history of our ancestors and progenitors all the way back to apes, the first primates, the first mammals, the first lizards, the first amphibians, all the way back to fish, and even farther back to the first organisms. Now again, this is a very biological perspective on what it means to be human. And I want to introduce one last picture, which is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who's known for Lamarckian evolution, which is the idea that creatures adapted to their environment and they innately sensed that and became what they needed to be. And while the vast majority of the history of what we now are as humans relates to Darwinian evolution and selective pressures, the fact that we now have language, we have technology, we have this idea to form communities and to write our own history, that what we are going to be in the future is up to other things that we can self-determine. And whether that ultimately is a good thing or a bad thing as a whole or individually, that is kind of the thought I wanted to leave you with. And this is an idea that my class was very interested in exploring in terms of what is Darwinian versus Lamarckian evolution from the perspective of culture and society. And I will now leave it at that. And I'll address some of the questions that I saw popping up in local chat in just a minute. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your time and attention.